Hello, this is Mr. Smith, and it is about almost midterm season here at the university. We're the spring 2022 semester. We're about halfway through the semester, and the topic for tonight is MLK and the Cosmic Musical Revolution. It's March 9th. I'm Mr. Smith. I am the instructor of a religious studies course 3300, The Rhetoric and Theology of Nonviolent Social Change. So I am also very excited that King, in his theology, understood the universe. It is very common today when you meet people who are what they call spiritual but not religious, that they will often speak of the universe instead of God. King is one who understood this idea of a cosmic Christ, or as it's been come to be called, or a universal Christ, or a cosmic creation where all things are interrelated. Martin said, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. All people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. This is the interrelated structure of reality. Wow, man. So as you are probably aware, and I'm a scholar of the 60s, I study the 60s and all of its different elements at the 60s and 70s, or what is sometimes called the counterculture. And so you're probably aware that a whole social movement, in addition to, as we've already spoken on this call about Black Power, and we spoke about feminism, we even spoke a little bit about gay and lesbian rights. Well, just as that is emerging, also there's a whole kind of colorful, we talked a little bit about African hairstyles and African dress as a part of the Black Power lecture. Well, there was a whole movement, for lack of a better word, called the hippie movement. Now, the hippies, the thing about the hippies is originally this term hippie was created almost kind of as an insult, and it comes off of a term called hipster. Hipster has now, of course, been revived in the 21st century, but King actually was aware of and adjacent to all of the many vibrations that were happening. Now, he didn't live to see Marvin Gaye's beautiful album, What's Going On, but he lived into the moment when this movement was happening. And I was actually able a couple of years ago to dig up a paper or a commentary that Dr. King gave on the cultural revolution that was happening all around us, the counterculture revolution. When I was a child, I was very inspired by a Broadway play, later a Hollywood film called Hair. And this was an attempt, a pop culture attempt to sort of understand the hippie revolution. And it was a happening. It was a be-in. It was a total immersion in experiential music, all of your five senses, the smells, the colors. And one of the things in that film that is really amplified is interracial love. And this is breaking down a barrier that previously had not been broken down. And here are two of the protagonists in the film version of the Hair movie. And the woman on the right is in the movie pregnant, and she doesn't know which one of her friends that she's in her like kind of running crew, her little like mobile commune of street urchins. She doesn't know which one the dad is. And they joke about it. If he comes out brown, he belongs to this one character. If he comes out pink, he belongs to this other character. And so they were participating in the whole, free love thing. And it's interesting to me and amazing to me and inspiring to me that Martin Luther King Jr. actually talked about the hippies. And so these are some quotes from a statement that Dr. King made about the hippies, and I'm going to share it with you right now. These young people are currently called hippies. They may be traced in a fairly direct line from yesterday's beatniks. The hippies are not only colorful, but complex, and in many respects, their extreme conduct illuminates the negative effects of society's evils on sensitive young people. While there are variations, those who identify with this group have a common philosophy. They are struggling to disengage from society as their expression of their rejection to it. They disavow responsibility to organized society. Unlike the radicals, they're seeking not change, but flight. When occasionally they merge with a peace demonstration, it is not to better the political world, but to give expression to their own world. The hardcore hippie is a remarkable contradiction. He uses drugs to turn inward, away from reality, to find peace and security, yet he advocates love as the highest human value. Love, which can exist only in communication between people and not in the total isolation of the individual. The importance of the hippies is not their unconventional behavior, but in the fact that some hundreds of thousands of young people, in turning to a flight from reality, expressing a profoundly discrediting judgment on the society they emerge from. It seems to me that the hippies will not last long as a mass group. Well, in a sense, they didn't, and since they died out, and since as a movement, it wasn't really that much to begin with. But in another sense, in terms of the cultural reverberations of it, he's wrong. It's still going on today. Go to Manchester, Tennessee in June in the summertime and see the gathering at Bonnaroo, and you know what I'm talking about. They cannot survive because there is no solution and escape. Some of them may persist by solidifying into a secular religious sect. Now, many of them did form their own religions. This is called new religious movements. We might see some of them establish utopian colonies, like the 17th and 18th century communities established by sects. This happened as well. They did form communes. One of the most famous and long-lasting hippie communes is in Summertown, Tennessee. It's simply called The Farm. And he says that while many of these communes did not survive, they were important to the contemporaries because their dream of social justice and human value continues as a dream of all humankind. In this context, one dream of the hippie group is very significant. This is peace. Many of the hippies are pacifists, and a few have thought their way through a persuasive and psychologically sophisticated peace strategy. And society at large may be more ready now to learn from that dream than it was a century or two ago, to listen to the argument for peace, not as a dream, but as a practical possibility. So when we come back together, class, after spring break, of course, there'll be no class next Wednesday. We'll be spending a whole class period on Dr. King's vision of peace. And so keep this in mind, this idea of peace. And as the world is at war today, as of this, the moment of this very lecture, I want you to be thinking about your attitudes and opinions about violence and nonviolence in the practical sphere of everyday life, as well as in the global sphere of geopolitics, and be thinking what your commitments are around peace, because we'll be hearing from Dr. King's monumental contribution to peace studies in his Beyond Vietnam speech, one of the most transformational and life-changing sermons, because it was a stepping out of his genre or his contingency with an affinity with civil rights. He was seen as that being his lane of social change. And as we learned, Dr. King is a visionary for all seasons and all ages and for all causes and for all possibilities of the beloved community. And the beloved community is like that all-encompassing network of mutuality that we shared in that earlier quote. So King cannot stop his calling by the God of love that he knew in Jesus. He can't stop that when looking at war. He can't turn off a switch and say, this doesn't apply. And so be meditating on this, and of course on the conflict that's going on right now with Russia invading Ukraine, and be thinking about your views on peace and war, as we'll come to that at the lecture as we resume after the spring break. I'm now going to switch to talk to you about the history of African American music and the movement music that emerged from the African American musical tradition and, of course, the white folk music tradition to celebrate peace and social justice, and that becomes really kind of, just a pivot in terms of the movement. You saw a little bit in the Selma film that they were talking about, different famous singers and songwriters supporting the movement. King actually did speaking tours where he had bands kind of, backing him up. And the two primary genres of music in African American tradition, going back to the beginning of recorded music and to the beginning of the season after slavery, is the blues and gospel and the blues, and then all other strong Black American musical genres spring from this genesis in the gospel and the blues. And I'm going to speak to the Reverend Otis Moss III, who's a contemporary of mine. He's a little bit younger. He's an active African American preacher, and we're actually going to listen to a small portion of a sermon of his after this lecture, where he does what I would like to call hip hop theology or thug theology. But before we get to that, he also speaks to the gospel and the blues, and he says they could not distinguish between the gospel shout and the blues moan. Joy married to sorrow, tragedy engaged to triumph, praise and pain first cousins, worship and weeping constantly flirting with each other. And so while some scholars see the blues music and the gospel music as opposed, as oppositions, I think Dr. King would embrace them as siblings. And I think James Cone, who I'll refer to in a moment, and Cornel West, who I'll refer to in a moment, and Reverend Otis Moss, they would all be in agreement that the gospel and the blues are siblings and are the tangled roots deep in the earth and the soil of a broken country, and that they emerged to be this gift out of the tragedy and the horror of enslavement and Jim Crow and oppression. The musical gift of Black America, it's incredible, and it's redemptive, and it's liberating to everybody. And some folk find that liberation in the church music, and some folk find it in the secular blues music. Now, there will be some blues scholars who will feel betrayed by the church, so betrayed by the church that they would consider gospel to be kind of a sellout kind of music, worshiping who they perceived as the white God. Now, in African American liberation theology, of course, though, we don't see this God as being a white Jesus at all. We see that that the person that Martin Luther King was interested in was probably a Palestinian Jew, and he was probably a person of color, and he was definitely an outspoken social activist, the Jesus that Martin talked about. But it's from this cradle of blues and gospel music that the movement music, the freedom songs, like by the SNCC Freedom Singers and by other freedom singing groups, kind of emerged, and it becomes a kind of gasoline. It becomes a kind of fuel for the movement, because when people were in jail and they were struggling, they could sing, and in that singing they would feel the strength of their convictions in their bodies. They would feel the strength of their convictions in their bodies. So the tangled root is blues and gospel. And then from blues and gospel, you get the freedom songs, which are connected between the church and the secular. And then you'll as outgrowth of that, soul music, also R&B music, funk, all of these different genres emerge. And then finally, we get the genre of hip hop, which is a kind of poetry fused with rhythm. And this is a lineage. The African American musical tradition is a lineage, and it has always been adjacent to civil rights. I have a group of students who, for a research project in a elementary writing class, a primary writing class for first year college students. That's a required writing course. They're doing social movements as one of their topics. That's one that they're allowed to choose. Well, one group chose Black Lives Matter, and then they decided they wanted to focus on how Black Lives Matter was affecting the culture. So they're going to look at athletics and sports and music. And clearly, a King was influential on people like Muhammad Ali, the formerly known as Cassius Clay, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. These athletes that emerge also out of the movement become powerful icons of Black freedom, as well as the musicians. And so King was always adjacent to and very aware of the culture that was going on around him. And the entire movement has a soundtrack. I've shown a film before called Soundtrack to a Revolution. I believe it's only available via Amazon. I haven't figured out the compatibility for streaming Amazon through this platform. We're going to be watching another fantastic music movie at the conclusion of this lecture, but there's a movie out there on Amazon that you could watch on your own called Soundtrack to a Revolution, where they talk about the movement songs and they link it up with each of the stages in the movement, and then they recitate some of the great freedom songs for you. So Professor Cohn, and who's a Black liberation theologian, is also a scholar of the blues. He is a true believer, like Reverend Moss is, that. And so Cohn has written about Martin and Malcolm, by the way, too. So he's a Christian thinker, professor, a believer in Jesus. His most famous book about Jesus is The Cross and the Lynching Tree. But he's written about Martin and Malcolm. He's written about the blues and the gospel. And he says the blues are a lived experience, an encounter with the contradictions of American society, but a refusal to be conquered by it. The hope provides the strength to survive, and also an openness to the integrity of life's pains without being destroyed by them. And see, what the blues offers that maybe gospel doesn't is maybe a grittiness and edginess. There's sexuality, and there's humor, and there's some topics that are not that don't fit the same as with gospel, where salvation and eschatology and spiritual liberation is going to be the driving lyrical theme in gospel music. But Moss is saying it's the same energy, and it's the same vitality, and it's a different lens. I wear glasses. I talk about a lens. So I think what Moss would say is that gospel and blues are different lenses, but they're both commingling and co-creating for liberation. Now, Dr. West, known sometimes as a hip hop professor, he's been at like Harvard, Yale. He's been at Union Theological Seminary. He's really one of the leading Americans in Black studies. Actually, I think he had to leave one job because he put out a hip hop album. I don't have that source right in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. And he said the blues represents tragic comic hope in the face of dehumanizing hate and oppression. And so some of us got the blues right now. There's a lot of things happening in society today that give us the blues, things that get us down. And if we don't participate in spiritual bypass or toxic positivity, we know that the stuff is real. Like if I weren't lecturing, I would use a different word than stuff, right? I'd use a more savory word than that. But we know the stuff is real, y'all. And so the blues does not deny the grittiness, the harshness, the hardness of it all, but rather brings comedy, tragedy, and hope to the fore through the liberation of music. And West even talks about jazz. And I wish I was a true musicologist. I'm an amateur musicologist, but there's something about what the jazz does, and there's not even any lyrics there. But there's something about what jazz music did in the Black community, the way that the partakers of like a John Coltrane or a Charlie Parker, the way they would just blow their instrument. It was a kind of lament, a kind of a howling, moaning coming from the depths of you. And in each of these cases, what makes it authentic, what makes it real, what makes it relevant to liberation is that it comes out of your depths. It's not superficial. West goes on. He says the tragic comic maintains, quote, the ability to laugh and retain a sense of life's joy, to preserve hope even while staring in the face of hate and hypocrisy. He asserts that this tragic comic hope is most profoundly found in the wrenchingly honest yet compassionate voices of the Black freedom struggle. So it's in the movement, but it's in the movement through art, most poignantly in the painful eloquence of the blues, and most exuberantly in the improvisational virtuosity of jazz. That's what Brother Cornel West brings to us. And Reverend Moss, he drives this point home. He says, blues and gospel are the same thing. When you have your blues in the word of B.B. King, you say my thrill is gone. But if you want to switch it to gospel, don't change the chords, just change the lyrics to Precious Lord, Take My Hand, reminding you that's the Mahalia Jackson song that Martin loved to hear sung to him, that Mahalia sung at his funeral. It's the same thing. You just change the lyrics, says Reverend Moss. The blues deal with your existential situation, and the gospel deals with your eschatological situation. Existential situation is what we're going through right now here, and the eschatological is what's going to happen when God gets busy in our future. There's something happening over yonder. It won't be long now. Freedom's coming. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. All of that. There's been some backwards bending, Holden, on this thing. It's been flipping. It's like a rubber band. The arc was bending towards justice, and it got boomeranged back to a pre-1965. And that law that we were talking about, it passed the legislature. This class is, against the law. I always wanted to be an outlaw, but I wish it didn't have to happen this way. You know what I'm saying? I wish that we would have seen it, the error of our ways, and that we would have owned up to and acknowledged the error of our ways. And so I'm going to go through a kind of a Hall of Fame musicians. I've got a playlist I made for you, Mason, based on your request last week of Bernice Johnson Reagan, Sweet Honey in the Rock. I'll work on another playlist, and I'll just send those out to you all via email. You can listen to them on your own time, and I encourage you to consider making a playlist or a mixtape for your creative final. Before the film starts, I'll have a brief moment for comments and questions, and so I'm almost coming into the conclusion of this portion, and we'll pause, and I'll take your question there after I stop the recording. But let me share with you just a little bit of the Hall of Fame here. The Staples singers, pop staples. The young daughter, Mavis Staples, she's kind of now the grand matron of movement music, and she mainly travels in indie rock circles. She collaborated with Jeff Tweedy of Wilco, but she's a gospel, blues, pop singer, roots music singer that is very popular on the festival circuit, where you're going to see a lot of white fans out at those shows, like at some of the music festivals. I've seen her play a bunch of times, but the Staples Singers, Freedom Highway, that album, I mean, the whole album, it's like the soundtrack to the movement, can be seen through the Staples Singers. They have several different albums. I mean, if you want to just get a feeling for the 60s through Black roots music, just go and listen to any of the Staples Singers albums. People Get Ready is like an anthem. It ends up getting taken up, and Curtis Mayfield, that's only one of his many hits. He's through the 60s and the 70s. He's at that crossover between freedom songs, church music, and like funk and soul and all of it. Go get you some Curtis Mayfield. You won't be disappointed. But People Get Ready is definitely like his jam, his anthem. Marvin Gaye, the 1971 album, What's Going On, is the ecology movement, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, all of it. It's also like a church liturgy. It is the album of its time. It's exactly 52 years old, 51 years old this year, and it's so worth listening to. 1971, Marvin Gaye, What's Going On. It says everything that this class says in the form of an album. Harry Belafonte played calypso music, and he played a lot of different kinds of music, but Belafonte is a little bit earlier than some of these other people that I've mentioned, and he was a close associate. He was like a dear, dear, dear close friend of Dr. King's, and so Belafonte needs a shout out because he was like in the inner circle, the close group of friends of Martin Luther King Jr. and a great musician, Harry Belafonte. Nina Simone was kind of out there. She was kind of along the edges. She performed, though, on the Selma March, I believe it is, and she wrote a song called Mississippi Goddamn. She was not okay, and she wasn't taking it. She's Mason. She's kind of like a Black Power movement component, but she wrote the most heart-wrenching song after Martin's assassination called The King of Love is Dead. If you've never heard Nina Simone doing The King of Love is Dead, it's like a eulogy for Martin Luther King Jr. It's unbelievable and highly recommended. Nina Simone and her voice, there's something about her voice. She struggled. There's a great documentary about her life on Netflix, highly recommended, but she really struggled with the weight of being Nina Simone. And it's worth checking out that great documentary about her. But the song King of Love is Dead about Martin Luther King Jr. The white hippies from the Highlander Folk School who helped popularize alongside Pete Seeger, We Shall Overcome, Guy and Candy Carawan. And they're kind of like underground folkies, but they're really worth mentioning. They lived this thing. They were there. They participated in the whole dealio. And Pete Seeger, you can't say enough about what Pete Seeger gave to the movement. I mean, he was a tireless crusader and songsmith. First, he was in the Weavers, and then later solo. And he collaborated with everybody. And he only died just a couple years ago. I think he was like 100. He was close to 100 years old. Love Pete Seeger, and Pete Seeger was a huge part of the movement. And I've already spoken on the call about a dear, dear friend of Martin's. I mean, they were close buddies, Joan Baez, and she was just a sweet and amazing voice in the movement. And she becomes kind of like that cosmic king. She speaks to feminism. She speaks to civil rights. She speaks to the peace movement. And she's still with us, and she's still even very active today. I just saw she made a post on her Facebook about Ukraine just the other day. Peter, Paul, and Mary here performing with John Denver at some kind of a protest. Leaving on a Jet Plane was a song about the Vietnam War. If I Had a Hammer, Where Have All the Flowers Gone, they made popular. They were just the coffee house came into your living room, hugely popular. And growing up at my house, it was Joan Baez, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan. Those records, Simon and Garfunkel, those records were always on the turntable at my parents' house when I was a very little boy. And they, right with the speeches of Dr. King, and they were the movement in song. Hip hop begins with poetry in this time period with Gil Scott-Heron and The Last Poets. And if you've never heard Gil Scott-Heron or The Last Poets, oh my gosh, you've got to hear them. I will promise you, I'll be sending you guys a mixtape with all of the artists that were just mentioned in this lecture, and I'll be sending that to you guys soon so you can enjoy it over your spring break. Michael Eric Dyson says that rap is a profound musical, cultural, and social creativity. Rap artists explore grammatical creativity, verbal wizardry, and linguistic innovation. Hip hop gets a bad rap for some of its subgenres for its content, but it is a legitimate poetic descendant of gospel and blues, and it's a vastly important part of the African American musical tradition. I've got this amazing sermon excerpt from a hip hop sermon from Otis Moss III, and I've got an amazing movie for you guys to watch. But I've got a couple minutes for comments and questions before we move on. So I'm going to stop the slideshow. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you so much, class, and welcome to those of you who got on the call just a moment late.